Hi, this is Jim Benson from Modus Cooperandi and Personal Kanban, and welcome to Collaberwocky. This is our first episode, and Collaberwocky is conversations about collaboration. Now, we could have done an interview show where I asked people questions that they probably already knew were coming, but I thought it would be more interesting to actually just have conversations and then put them out there and see what conversations spawned from them. So our first show is with Ladas Jabe Bloom. Corey is the author of Scrumban and is a lean software and systems pioneer. And Jabe is the CTO of the Library Corporation with offices in West Virginia, Colorado, and New York. And our first topic is intentional cooperation, so let's get right to it. All right. Okay, so this was intentional cooperation, and even though you just introduced it a second ago, Corey, can you introduce it again for those playing along at home?
Okay. It's fashionable to talk about cooperation and teamwork in business. But I worry that word is kind of tossed around in sort of a meaningless platitude kind of way, like it's just sort of, unreflective goodness, like motherhood and apple pie. And so we talk about it like it's something we should do, but I don't hear enough discussion about why. So what I'd like to see is people kind of talking about cooperation more thoughtfully, more mindfully, and treating it as a serious topic worthy of consideration and discussion on its own, right? And so rather than just giving people sort of unstructured, nebulous advice like go off and collaborate and be productive, let's take it a little bit more seriously and recognize that there are when we're cooperating in business, it's we're doing it for a reason, and that we need to do it with purpose, and that there are there is structure to cooperation, and that we need to do it intentionally in a way that maximizes our common interest.
So. One of the things that we've talked about a lot when working with people is that when you set up any structure, any collaborative structure, one of the first reactions that people will have to it is basically to judge what the utility of that structure is. So if you set up a team and you say, okay, this team's set up and we're going to build this thing together and we're going to use these tools, they're going to start evaluating the elements of that structure. And if that team or if those tools aren't what they want, and if they don't feel like they have the ability to change them, then they start to undermine that structure by gaming the system. So how much of what you're asking about is setting up intentional structures so that we can allay some of that gaming, or in the other way, encourage that gaming if it's useful and helpful?
Okay, so you put your finger exactly on it, right? It's the whole gaming the system thing is what I'm getting at, right? So, you game a system when you've been handed an arbitrary system that you didn't necessarily participate in its creation. What I'm saying is, don't do that. What you first need to do is agree upon the principles and rules of the game. You need to all agree amongst yourselves that playing the game will produce an outcome that you are all happy with, and then you can honestly play the game without having to resort to, gaming it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm asking for, is that sort of level of awareness about the design of our relationships.
I wonder if there's a certain amount of buy-in that, or not necessarily buy-in, but understanding of the bigger picture, or comfort with not being able to understand the bigger picture, that puts work in context, that makes people more willing to accept new teams, new structures, and new ways of working together. So like, one of the things is, like, let's say you have a group of CIA agents, and that group of CIA agents knows that they need to get this certain mission done, but they don't know anything else.
Yeah.
Anything else at all on the whole planet. They don't know why they're doing it, who they're doing it for. They just know that they've been given these orders to do this thing. They're willing to do that with a large amount of vagueness because they've already bought into a larger system that says this is the way that your work is going to be handed out, and it's all part of that game. But when I see companies where people feel like they don't understand what their bosses are doing, or what their bosses' bosses or bosses' bosses' bosses are doing, then they're much less likely to collaborate because they don't have an edict. That vagueness is not part of their game. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, Jabe, when you've been trying to encourage your teams from moving from a very non-collaborative space into more collaborative spaces, have these been issues?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the key things that I keep on exploring with people, which is I think is particularly difficult to get the snowball rolling down the hill, as it were, is it kind of intentional versus intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators. So you guys talking about purposeful systems and designed systems, which I like. Some of my focus with my teams has been trying to make the game, the rules themselves, as malleable as possible, to encourage intrinsic motivation. So to encourage people to believe that they are in control of the game itself, so that they're not entirely extrinsically motivated. In other words, the constraints should be about the rules should be about focusing the team on achieving a goal. They shouldn't be about motivating the team. One of the cudgels that I've been cudgeling around a lot recently is deadlines. I think deadlines are the worst form of motivation on the planet. And a lot of people say to me, well, listen, if I didn't have a deadline, I wouldn't get my stuff done. And I say, you probably have too much stuff already, so it wouldn't be so bad if you didn't do some of it. Maybe if you can't be motivated enough to achieve something without a deadline, you weren't going to do it very well to begin with. Maybe you should find other things to do that actually motivate you and inspire you to do the work without requiring you to be externally motivated by something as blunt as it has to be done at this particular time. So I think, as we go around designing collaborative systems and teams, for me, really allowing teams to have control of their own rule sets is really, really critical. It's one of the reasons I really enjoy Kanban and personal Kanban, is because they allow you to kind of keep the system malleable. And I also I'm a super not a fan of recipe behavior. So like hyper productivity in 6 weeks kind of sets me on edge. If that makes sense. So I don't know. Does that make sense to you guys?
Oh, absolutely. I've been receiving a lot of advice that says that I have to start counting things. So the 5 ways that people can achieve better productivity, or 10 ways that you can, comb your hair, or 11 ways that you can cut your own legs off and beat yourself to death with them. And and I've been kind of engaged in about a 4-day weird battle on Twitter about this, where I put out a little tweet that basically said, you know, you might want to watch out for best practices, and then everybody, a depressingly large number of people came back saying, you know, best practices are really best practices, and you should pay attention to them. Right. And it's best practices are those thoughtless games that you take from somebody else's play field and you bring them into your play field and you say, okay, here, this game worked really well over there, so now we're going to try it here. And the game is called hockey, and we are in the Bahamas. Go! And it drives me absolutely batty, and it's more upsetting to me, actually, that people aren't quite understanding that message. I don't know if I'm not delivering it right, or if it's because Twitter is just a bad medium for getting complex thought across.
So yeah, well, Twitter is so certainly a bad medium for expressing complex thought, but
yeah, unless you're particularly good at memification, which is part of the problem with Twitter, right? Because all the stuff you see that bounces around Twitter tends to be the stuff that you can't get out of your head because it's just been memified just right.
Yeah.
There's not necessarily a measure of goodness.
Twitter is like more about substitutions for thought than it is about actual thought.
It's like in Willy Wonka, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where they had the chewing gum that was an entire meal as opposed to the entire meal.
Yeah. So getting back to your best practices thing, Benjamin Mitchell really got me into Chris. I can never pronounce his name. Argyrius, is that his name? And kind of double loop learning and type 1, type 2 type stuff. I spent at least 2 years having the coworker that I work with, the other C-level executive that I work with, telling me that I just had to stop being angry at people for being stupid. And that book was like really important for me to be like, oh wait, they're not dumb. Like they have a different perspective on it. And not only that, but since I kind of have a rebellious attitude about life, I was always like, doesn't everybody want to like be free and do their own thing? And the answer is clearly no. A lot of people want to be told what to do, really. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it is a thing. People take comfort in having someone come to them and tell them explicitly, this is the goal and this is how you'll achieve the goal. Now just do the work, which is a radically different way of looking at the world than I do as a trained artist and philosophy type person. I've always been like, you're supposed to change the world and explore it and make new things. So that's kind of interesting to me. That I think that it's really intrinsic in human nature, and certainly in our society, for people to want a checklist. They want it. They want the checklist to say that they've done it correctly. It's really endemic. It's really hard to get around. And
work with software development where there is no right way to do anything. There's only ways to screw things up. All we do in software development is make horrible things that somebody will come along later and make a slightly better version of our horrible thing. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I think that there's not an easy answer for getting around that corner, and it has to do with the intrinsic extrinsic motivation stuff as well. Like people. I don't know.
Yeah, I think some of what you were saying, Jabe, is why we still need to have things like coaches and managers around, right? Some of us are going to be more predisposed to be able to observe that kind of human nature element to the way that people work together than others. I would argue that a lot of what you're saying ends up being about empathy and compassion, right? Like recognizing that people have different kinds of personalities and motivations, and understanding that there's going to be a place for your sort of rebellious self-starters, and that there's also going to be a place for someone might be a very, meticulous, disciplined craftsperson, but likes to work from a list of things to accomplish and is not especially interested on coming up with things on their own. And there's a place for that. That actually ended up being a policy issue at Microsoft when I was there. That there was this kind of bulge of level 62 SDEs, which is like the last non-senior dev level. And so these were people who were very experienced software developers and who were actually the most productive developers in the company. But they topped out at 62 because the next level beyond that assumed that there was going to be leadership or management responsibilities. And so what happened was all of these really awesome, master craftsmen sort of bump up against this limit, and that was in conflict with a kind of an up or out policy for the company. The idea was that you were either making progress in your career and advancing and getting ahead, or you needed to maybe start thinking about doing something else. And we realized that we had to make a concession to that reality, that the people who were in fact the most productive employees in the company were going to kind of top out at some point, and that we had to allow them to do that, and that it was in fact good for everybody to make room for that. So it's hard. It's easy to get sort of wrapped up in your ideology that says that everybody has to be a self-actualizing superachiever, but the fact is that people aren't like that.
Yeah, I think it's not just that, but diversity in so many ways is important for a robust, resilient organization, right? So having a single mold or a single idea of what successful employees look like results in a lot of employees looking a lot alike and thinking a lot alike. And the result of that, I think, is blind spots for the organization. They don't see things coming in the same way. I have an engineer who's constantly reminding me of the things I say, because I'll say things like, we have to really think about making the simplest possible version of this. So we should have, a marketing site and a web service. And he's like, wait a second. We haven't built anything yet. Like, simplify. I'm like, oh yeah, right. That's what I mean. Yes, you're right. But he has the ability to kind of see the simplest path to get there, whereas I tend to be, I tend to go much more grandiose. And our relationship, because we have those different perspectives, has been really productive because we have a nice tension where I try to get him to go bigger and he tries to get me to stay small. So I think that type of collaborative behavior is really important for people to recognize and kind of encourage in organizations, because I think in a lot of organizations the opposite happens, where, like you were describing, people need to go into management or leadership where they need to be basically extreme extroverts. They need to inspire people. They need to have vision and all this kind of not necessarily useful stuff.
Yeah, and impact was my favorite bullshit word.
Right, yeah.
Well, do you think that this might actually be so us wanting everybody to be creative, or assuming that everybody's going to be creative, is like rich people assuming that everybody is going to be rich, and if they don't, there's something wrong with them? Might there be some sort of socioeconomics of what people choose to do and how they choose to do it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some value systems being put in play that not everybody shares. I mean, again, I was trained as a fine artist in college, and I can guarantee you some of my employees could give a shit less about fine art at all, and that's fine. In college I would have been annoyed by them, but now I'm not. I think it's perfectly reasonable. one of my favorite stories about when I got here, they're so different from the way that I think about the world. I got here from New York City, and I didn't have a car. And after being here for about 3 or 4 weeks, someone came up to me and said, "You know, there's a rumor that you have a DWI." I said, "What? Why would I have a DWI?" And they're like, "Well, nobody doesn't drive. Everybody has a car. Clearly, you have had your license taken away from you." Which was like a radically different way for me to think about the world. I had never really kind of considered that. These guys all, they drive muscle cars. They work on their cars on the weekend. That's awesome. It's not something I enjoy doing, but I think it's a perfectly valid way to kind of do your thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
So that's about 18 minutes for this topic. Shall we move on to the next?
Sure.
So that's the end of episode 1. Tune in a few days for episode 2, and we will discuss the language of management. And we'll see you then.